The light does not leave Egypt the way it leaves other places. It lingers, it spreads itself thin across the sandstone and the river and the long flat rooftops of the city, as though it cannot quite bring itself to go, as though even the sun, after all these thousands of years, still finds it difficult to say goodbye to this particular place. And in that last amber hour, when the shadows grow long and the Nile turns the colour of hammered copper, the city of Thebes begins to breathe differently. The noise of the day, the hammer, the cart, the argument, the prayer, softens one sound at a time until what remains is something quieter and older than any of it. Settle in now, pull whatever is warm a little closer around you, because we are about to go somewhere very far away. Somewhere the stars look the same, but everything beneath them is beautifully, utterly different. A woman named Nefertari, not the queen, but a weaver who lives 3 streets from the river, sets down her work as the last light touches the top of the far wall and then disappears. She does not check a clock. There are no clocks. She reads the quality of the air the way you might read a familiar face, and she knows, the way she has always known, that the day is finished. Around her, the city agrees. Fires are lit in doorways. Children are called in from the dust. Somewhere nearby, a man named Amenhotep, a baker who has been awake since before the darkness last ended, finally sits down on a low wooden stool and closes his eyes for just a moment, his flower-white hands resting open in his lap like something offered. This is the hour the Egyptians called the time of going in. Not sunset, not evening, the going in, as though the night were not an absence but a place, a room you entered, a threshold you crossed with intention and with care. They did not stumble into sleep the way we sometimes do, fully dressed on a sofa with a light still burning somewhere. Sleep to them was a destination, and like any journey worth taking, it required preparation. The streets do not go entirely silent. They never do, not in a city this size, not along a river this busy. But the sounds that remain are softer ones. A woman humming, water being poured into a clay vessel, the low conversation of 2 neighbours who have said good night to each other every evening for 30 years and have not yet run out of things to say, the particular peaceful sound of a civilization winding down, not ending, never ending, only pausing, the way a song pauses before its final, most beautiful verse. Nefertari picks up the small clay lamp from the floor beside her mat and carries it carefully toward the inner room. The flame does not waver. Her hand is that steady, and in the warm circle of its light, she begins. In the next room, on a low shelf worn smooth by years of the same reaching hand, a small alabaster jar is waiting. The jar is no larger than a fist. Its surface is the color of pale winter honey, and when Nefertari lifts it, it is cool against her palm in the way that stone is always cool, no matter how warm the day has been. She does not open it carelessly. There is a particular way she removes the stopper, a slow turn, a small pause that she learned from her mother, who learned it from hers, that she learned from her mother, who learned it from hers, in a chain of quiet instruction that stretches back further than either of them ever thought to count. The smell that rises is sweet and green and faintly resinous, a blend of moringa oil pressed from the seeds of trees that grow along the river, mixed with a trace of kaifi, the sacred incense compound the temples burned at dusk to help the sun god Ra complete his nightly journey through the underworld. They used it on their skin. That is what this is. A nightly ritual of oils and unguents and careful, deliberate attention to the body, not out of vanity, though beauty mattered enormously to them, but out of something closer to duty. The body, in Egyptian belief, was not merely a vessel you inhabited. It was a sacred object, one of several components that made up a complete human being, and it required maintenance the way a temple required maintenance. To neglect it was not laziness. It was a kind of disrespect toward yourself, toward the gods, toward the intricate cosmic architecture that had gone to such trouble to assemble you. Nefertari smoothed the oil along her arms with slow, unhurried strokes. The lamp flame bends slightly in some unfelt draught and then straightens again. Outside, the last sounds of the street are fading. She works the oil into her hands between her fingers across the back of her neck, the places where the desert takes its toll, where the sun and the wind and the dry air leave their marks by the end of every day. This is not a luxury. In a climate that could crack leather, that could age a face in a season, this was simply what you did, what your mother told you to do, what you would one day tell your daughter to do, in this same room, by this same light, with this same small jar, or one very like it. Archaeologists have found these jars in their thousands, in tombs, in household ruins, in the buried corners of rooms that no longer have walls. They have found the residue of the oils still faintly present in the stone, even after 3,000 years. The chemistry of care preserved. Someone thought to analyze it, to identify the compounds, to reconstruct what it must have smelled like. And for a moment in a laboratory somewhere, an ancient Egyptian evening existed again, briefly in the air. There is something in that which is almost unbearable in its tenderness. All those careful hands, all those small jars, all those ordinary nights. When the oil was set aside, she reached for something smaller still, a dark paste kept in a twist of linen, and the preparation became, in the most ancient sense, sacred. The temples closed their outer doors at dusk, but they did not go quiet. Inside, in the deep interior rooms that ordinary people never entered, the priests continued their work, the endless, meticulous, cosmologically necessary work of keeping the universe in order. They burned kaifi in great stone bowls. They recited the prayers that were not optional, that were not devotional in the casual modern sense, but were understood to be structurally essential, the verbal scaffolding that held the sky in place, that helped Ra navigate the 12 dark hours of the underworld, that ensured, through the mechanism of human attention and human voice, that the sun would complete its journey and return. This is what the Egyptians believed the night was. Not an absence of day, not a resting of the light, but an active, ongoing, deeply perilous journey every night. But an active, ongoing, deeply perilous journey every night. The sun god sailed his golden bark into the mouth of the western horizon and descended into the Duat, the underworld where he would travel through 12 gates, each more dangerous than the last, each guarded by serpents and shadows and forces that would very much prefer the sun not to return. He would be challenged. He would face the great serpent Apophis, the embodiment of chaos, who waited in the 5th hour of the night and attempted, every single night, without exception, to swallow the sun whole and end the world. And every single night he failed. The priests helped, the prayers helped, the burning of the incense helped, and Ra, renewed, emerged from the eastern horizon at dawn, not the same Ra who had descended, but a young Ra, a renewed Ra, reborn each morning from the body of the sky goddess Nut, who swallowed him each evening and gave him back each dawn. You did not have to be a priest to participate in this. The ordinary person lying down on their mat in their small house near the river was also a participant. The oils they had rubbed into their skin were not merely cosmetic. Many of them carried protective properties, both practical and symbolic. The amulets they kept nearby held specific magical functions. The very act of lying down in the correct position, in the correct place, with the correct prayers, murmured half aloud into the darkness, all of it was a form of cooperation with the cosmic effort. Sleep was not an escape. It was a participation. You closed your eyes, and the world kept working, and you, in your small way, helped. A child named Kay, 7 years old, and already serious in the way that children sometimes are, lay on his mat near the wall and listened to his grandmother murmur the evening prayers beside him, words he did not yet fully understand, but knew in his body were important. He matched his breathing to hers without thinking, and the night settled around them both like something familiar. But the prayers were only part of it. What the body rested upon mattered as much as what the lips whispered in the dark. It was not much to look at if you arrived expecting something grand. A low wooden frame, raised just slightly from the floor on 4 simple legs, the surface strung with interwoven cords or strips of hide that formed a kind of flexible base, firm but not rigid, the way a hammock is firm, yielding just enough to receive the weight of a body, with a kind of gentleness. The wealthy had theirs inlaid with ivory and ebony, carved at the foot with the heads of lions or the gilded faces of protective deities. The craftsman and the weaver had simpler versions, worn smooth at the edges from years of the same hand, but the shape was consistent across all of them, and that shape was consistent across all of them, and that shape was intentional. Egyptian beds sloped. From head to foot, they ran at a slight downward angle, so that the sleeper's head was higher than their feet, and at the lower end, at the foot of the bed, a small wooden board prevented the sleeper from sliding down through the night. This footboard, this small, practical, utterly ordinary detail, it is one of those things that seems so minor until you sit with it long enough, until you try to imagine sleeping on a surface that slopes night after night, and you realize you would need something at the end to stop you drifting, and that someone thousands of years ago noticed exactly this problem and solved it quietly in wood. And at the head of the bed, or often beside it, or cradled beneath the neck of the sleeper, was the headrest, not a pillow, not a cushion, a headrest, a curved, rigid support, often made of wood or alabaster or faience, shaped like a small pedestal with a concave top that was fitted to receive the curve of a human neck. They look uncomfortable to modern eyes. They look like something you might rest a sculpture on, not a sleeping person. That the Egyptians slept on their sides, and the headrest lifted the head just enough to keep the neck aligned, to keep the ears clear of the mat, to allow the air to circulate, and practically, in a desert climate plagued by insects and scorpions, to keep the head elevated above the floor where such things tended to travel. But beyond the practical, the headrest was believed to be protective. The imagery carved into them was deliberate. The god Bes, protector of households and children, appeared frequently, his fierce leonine face and his dancing body, a guardian of the sleeper's most vulnerable hours. To rest your head upon Bes was to place yourself, quite literally, under. Is protection for the night. There is something in this that does not require translation across millennia. To make the place where you sleep safe, to carve a kind face into the thing that holds your head while you are unconscious and unguarded. To say, with wood and chisel and careful hands, here, while you cannot protect yourself, something watches. And yet the truest protection, the priests would have said, lay not in the carved wood beneath the neck, but in the invisible architecture the mind entered when the eyes finally closed. When sleep came, it did not come empty. This was understood. This was not speculation or folk belief casually held. This was doctrine, as firmly established as the movement of the stars or the flooding of the Nile. Dreams were transmissions. They arrived from somewhere else, passed through the sleeping mind the way water passes through a reed. And when morning came, they carried meaning that belonged not only to the dreamer, but to anyone skilled enough to receive and interpret it. Dreams were a form of language, and the language had experts. The Egyptians called them the learned ones of the library of the House of Life, the priest interpreters who kept the great papyrus manuals of dream symbolism, the books of what things meant. If you dreamed of diving into the river, it was an omen of good fortune. If you dreamed of your teeth falling out, it was not good. If you dreamed of a large cat or a white horse or a dead relative standing in a doorway speaking words you could not hear, There were pages for all of these, columns of careful script, compiled across centuries. Calms of careful script, compiled across centuries. The distilled experience of thousands of dreams and thousands of mornings and thousands of moments of asking, what did it mean? What was I being told? What am I supposed to do now? A woman named Merit, a singer at the Temple of Ammon, had a dream in her 40th year that Sats he could not shake. She dreamed of a field she did not recognize, full of grain that was golden and still, and in the middle of it a door standing open with no building around it, just the door freestanding, light coming through from the other side. She went to the dream interpreter in the morning, as you would go to a physician, as a matter of course. He listened. He consulted the texts. He told her the door was a threshold between this life and the next, and the open light was the indication that the crossing, when it came, would be peaceful. She was not frightened by this. That is the part that stays with you across all this distance. She was not frightened. She thanked him and went back to her work at the temple and lived by the records another 18 years, because to the Egyptian mind, death was not the terrible thing. The terrible thing was the second death, the death of the name, the death of memory, the complete erasure of a person from the world of the living and from the reckoning of the gods. That was the thing to fear. The first death, the one that came for the body, was simply the night part of a longer day, and if your dreams were the rehearsal for that crossing, then the more you paid attention to them, the better prepared you became. Car, the serious boy, woke often with fragments he could not hold, images dissolving like oil into water, feeling but no picture. His grandmother told him to lie still for a moment before opening his eyes, to hold whatever remained. What you caught in that first still moment of waking was yours. What you released was returned to the dark, and the dark kept its own counsel. There are things that belong to the day and things that belong to the night, and in ancient Egypt the boundary between them was observed with a precision that modern life has largely forgotten. Certain foods were not eaten after dark. Certain tools were set down and not picked up again until morning. Certain paths through the city were avoided, not because they were physically dangerous, though some were, but because the hours of darkness were inhabited by forces that the light kept orderly, and in the dark those forces moved more freely, and it was considered simply unwise to attract their attention unnecessarily. And then there were the names. Specifically, there was your true name, your Ren, as the Egyptians called it, which was one of the 5 components of the complete self, as fundamental to your existence as your shadow or your soul. The Ren was not merely what people called you. It was a portion of your being, woven into the fabric of who you were. To speak it was to invoke you. To erase it was to begin your destruction. This was why the names of enemies were sometimes hacked from stone monuments, not as insult only, but as a kind of magical assault on their continued existence. And after the sun went down, when the border between the living world and the duat grew thin and permeable, and the beings who moved through that border were close and listening, you did not say your true name aloud, not carelessly, not without reason. A mother knew this. She taught it the way she taught other necessary things, not with great ceremony, but as a quiet instruction given at the right moment in the right tone, so that the child understood this was not superstition, but sense. A girl named 8 years old, curious in the way that made adults both love and tire of her, asked her mother once why. And her mother sat down beside her in the cooling evening air and explained it the way the explanation had always been given, that names had weight, that weight attracted, that in the hours when the dark things listened, it was better to be quiet and small and unannounced. Isit accepted this with the pragmatic logic of a child who has been given a reason that makes sense and thereafter whispered at dusk even her own name, as though testing the edge of something she had been told not to touch. The everydays, the names used by neighbours and market vendors, and the man who repaired sandals near the north gate, those were different. Those were the names of the surface, the names of transaction and greeting. The true name was held inside, like a lamp cupped in both hands against the wind. Some people carried it through an entire life without ever releasing it carelessly. There is something in this that resonates even now, even here, even from this impossible distance. The intuition that some things are safest when kept close, that not everything requires announcement, that the night has its own acoustics, and it is worth being thoughtful about what you let echo. And so the family settled into their places, each carrying their private interior name like a warm stone in the pocket as the house grew quiet and the last lamp was considered. The last lamp was not put out all at once. This was one of those details that no official text records, but that archaeology whispers to us through the arrangement of rooms and the placement of objects and the simple logic of being human in the dark. Someone, a parent, a grandmother, an older sibling, stayed up a little longer than the children. There was always this, in every civilization, in every century, the one who waits until the small ones are breathing slowly before allowing themselves to rest. Nefertari's youngest, a boy of 4 named Huni, did not like the full dark. This was not unusual. This was not a failing. The Egyptians had, in fact, an entire system of protective objects specifically designed for the beds of children. Amulets of faience and bone and hammered copper carved into the shapes of gods and animals, and these symbols whose meanings had been tested by accumulated generations of hopeful, watchful parents. The dwarf god Bes appeared again here, as he appeared everywhere. Children slept, his grotesque, beloved face painted on the walls of birthing chambers and nurseries. His image hung above small beds, his presence understood to repel the demons and the night terrors and the malicious unseen things that were drawn, for reasons the texts were careful to explain, particularly toward the very young. Huni wore a small faience amulet on a cord around his neck, a tayat knot, the symbol of Isis, which carried protective properties associated specifically with the body's blood and life force. His mother had put it there when he was an infant, had replaced the cord twice as he grew, had checked the knot of it with her thumb each night before she settled him. It was slightly chipped at one edge. He had bitten it at some point, the way small children bite things, and she had considered replacing it, but had not. The chip felt like his now. The object had become specific to him. This is the kind of detail that historians note carefully and clinical analysts categorize correctly and completely miss the weight of: a chipped amulet, a mother who noticed the chip and kept it anyway. The decision that an object worn smooth and slightly broken by a particular child is more powerful than a new and perfect one. There is a whole theology of love in that decision, and it requires no translation. Beyond the amulets, the placement of the sleeping child was deliberate. Near the interior wall, away from the door, away from the window, if there was one. Close enough to the sleeping adult that breathing could be monitored without waking. The mat beneath the child was padded more than the adult's, extra linen, extra consideration, and the position of the headrest, if the child used one at all at dist. His age was checked and adjusted before the lamp was reduced to its lowest flame. Huni fell asleep, holding his mother's hand. She waited until his grip loosened, that particular, unmistakable loosening that every parent knows, before she gently freed herself. She did not move quickly. She sat beside him for a moment in the near dark, watching the small rise and fall of his chest, doing what parents have always done in the quiet after a child sleeps, simply being grateful without quite knowing what to call it. In the room beside theirs, the grandmother began the prayer that ended every day, her voice so low it was almost only breath. We do not have them. This is one of the quiet losses of ancient history. Not the great monuments, not the military records, not the administrative papyri that catalogue the grain stores and the cattle counts and the flood measurements of the Nile. Those we have in abundance. What we do not have is the music that was sung to children in the dark, the lullabies, the soft, low, wordless sounds that a mother makes to settle a frightened child or deepen the sleep of a peaceful one. Those were never written down because they did not need to be written down. Everyone knew them. Every woman learned them without being taught them, in the way you learn certain things, through the body, through repetition, through being once yourself a child who was sung to. They existed. This much we can say with certainty. We have written references to the singing of nurses, to the use of music in the household, to the role of song in ritual and in daily life. The Egyptians were a deeply musical civilization, with instruments as varied and sophisticated as any in the ancient world. Harps the height of a standing woman, small wooden clappers shaped like hands, lutes with long graceful necks, drums, sistrums, the human voice, understood to be among the most overfull instruments of all. They sang at festivals, and they sang at funerals, and they sang while they worked, and they sang without question to their children. We simply do not have the songs. There is a word for this particular kind of loss, the loss of things that were too ordinary to preserve, but it sits in the space between grief and acceptance, and it is one of the quietest emotions history can produce. All those voices, all those specific personal melodies that belonged to a particular mother and a particular child in a particular room that no longer has walls, gone so completely that even the echo is gone. We cannot reconstruct them. We cannot approximate them. We can only know they were there and feel the outline of their absence the way you feel the outline of a door that has been bricked over. You can see where it was. You can trace the shape of it, but you cannot go through. What we do have is the poetry. Love poems, family poems. Poems that speak with such intimacy about the domestic interior of Egyptian life that they feel like overhearing something not meant for us. In these poems there are mothers described in terms of warmth and steadiness, compared to sheltering trees, to the banks of the river, to the shade that a traveller finds unexpectedly in a difficult place. The love described in these poems is not grand or performative. It is daily and specific and rooted in routine. It is the love of someone who checks the amulet cord each night, who waits for the grip to loosen, who stays a moment longer than necessary. And that love had a sound. We are only missing the notes. The grandmother's prayer ended, and the house held the particular silence of a place where everyone inside it is loved. The word they used, and we must be careful here, because translation is always an act of gentle distortion. The concept they held of sleep was wrapped in the same vocabulary they used for a certain kind of death, not the frightening kind, the temporary kind. Sleep was the nightly experience of the soul leaving the body in the way the soul would one day leave it permanently. A rehearsal, if you will, though they would not have used that word. A practice crossing, a small, safe, reversible visit to the territory that waited on the other side of the final night. The ba, one of those 5 components of the complete self, usually depicted as a human-headed bird, was understood to leave the body during sleep and travel freely through the world, through dreams, through the layered geography of the Duat itself, returning to the body at waking as the sun returned to the eastern horizon at dawn. This was not frightening to them. This is the crucial thing that requires emphasis, because the modern mind tends to find it unsettling, the idea of the soul leaving the body in the night, the body lying there without its full complement of self. But to the Egyptian this was simply the nature of sleep, normal, accepted, proof, in fact, that you were properly constituted, that your ba was healthy and functioning, that your relationship to the divine order was intact. The body left behind was not unprotected. The amulets, the prayers, the placement in the room, the architectural logic of the house itself, which was laid out with protective intent, with certain thresholds marked, certain corners attended to, certain symbols inscribed above doorways not as decoration, but as functional warding. The sleeping body was a temple whose primary inhabitant was temporarily elsewhere, and you maintained a temple in the owner's absence. And because each night was this rehearsal, this repeated, accumulated practice of the soul's departure and return, the Egyptians approached death with a familiarity that their neighbours found extraordinary. They planned, none for it meticulously, yes, but not with dread, with the calm practicality of someone who has already done the first difficult part 10,000 times and knows how it begins. They had fallen asleep and woken up so many thousands of mornings that the larger sleep did not strike them as categorically different. Only larger, only longer, only the night from which the morning would be more beautiful than any they had previously known. There is something in this so generous, so architecturally compassionate, that it is difficult to look at directly. They built their entire cosmology so that death was familiar, so that when you arrived at the edge of the last night, you would recognize the territory, you would know how to lie down, you would know what waited on the other side of the dark. You would not be afraid because you had already been there briefly, every night of your life. Nefertari set down the lamp and lay back on her mat in the cool of the room and felt the familiar loosening begin at the edges of herself, the slow, trusted dissolution she had felt 10,000 times, and gave herself to it, willingly, as she always did. Tomorrow would come the way it always came, announced by light, made new by simply arriving, and she would be there to meet it. It is still dark when the first sound reaches the city. Not the full sound of morning, not yet, but the preliminary sound. The sound that exists in the half hour before dawn, when the birds are not yet certain and the sky is not yet committed, but something has shifted in the quality of the dark, a softening, a thinning. The particular shade of blue-black that exists only in these minutes, when the night is finishing its last and most delicate work before handing the world back. The priests in the temple have been awake for all of it. They have carried the night through every one of its 12 gates. They have rayed and burned and recited and kept their careful world-sustaining vigil. And now, in this final hour, they await the moment they have awaited every night for as long as the temple has stood, the moment that Ra, renewed and young and burning with the particular fire of things reborn, clears the eastern edge of the world and offers the day back to the living. Amenhotep the baker is already at his work. He was awake before the priests said their final prayer, before the sky began its softening, because bread does not wait for cosmology, and the ovens take time to reach their heat. His arms move in the darkness with a muscle memory so deep it is practically inherited. The push and fold, the push and fold, the push and fold, the rhythm that has shaped his mornings for 20 years. His youngest daughter, not yet 5, has followed him from her mat and sits on a low step near the oven's warmth, watching her father work with the solemn attention of someone learning something important without knowing they are learning it. Huni wakes slowly, the way children wake when they have slept well, not all at once, but in layers, surfacing gradually from a depth that held him gently through the dark. He reaches for his mother before he opens his eyes, finds her hand, holds it. She was already awake, as she always was before him. She had been lying there in the quiet, listening to the pre-dawn. She had been lying there in the quiet, listening to the pre-dawn, doing what she did each morning in these few minutes before the day required something from her, simply being still, simply breathing, simply holding the morning like water in cupped hands before it spilled into everything. The sun rises. It always rises. It rose this morning. And it rose on every morning before this one, all the way back to the first morning. which the Egyptians could describe in detail because they had thought about it carefully and believed that thinking carefully was itself a form of devotion. The light comes first to the tops of the great stone monuments, the obelisks and the temple pylons and the faces of the gods carved into the cliffside, and then it comes down, slowly, generously, to the rooftops, to the streets, to the river, to the doorways of ordinary houses where ordinary people are standing in the threshold, faces lifted as they have stood every morning of their lives. Nefertari stands in her doorway and feels the warmth arrive on her face like something promised and kept. Behind her, the small alabaster jar sits on its shelf. The amulet cord hangs on its peg. The headrest waits at the head of the empty mat. All the small instruments of the night, patient and still, already waiting for evening to come around again. She does not think about any of this. It is too ordinary to think about. It is only life, only the particular irreplaceable texture of a life lived in this body, in this city, beside this river, under this sun, and across the impossible distance of 5,000 years, in the quiet and the dark, wherever you are, you close your eyes and you let the warmth find your face too. Sleep now. The sun knows the way back. It has never once forgotten.